Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this impromptu episode of the Lavigne Show. As I kind of came into a bunch of information around the ostriches thing. If you're seeing this headline, the title is "Inside the Universal Ostrich Farm Battle with Dr. Stephen Pelech Speaks Out." What's going on here as we wait for him to join, because we've confirmed he's coming right now. I've been digging into this for the past few days. The ostrich thing, I kind of stayed away from it. A lot of people were covering it, and these issues require a lot of work. And I've been putting in a lot of work recently to figure out what's going on with this. And along my way, I'm digging into information that doesn't seem to be very public. Some of it's public, some of it isn't. A lot of people are talking about saving the ostriches and that kind of stuff. And I'm looking into what's going on here. As you know, I follow the courts a lot. I follow government overreach. I fight against that because it happens all the time in various situations. So I had a very skeptical mindset on this, looking into it. And as more and more information came up, more people were providing me stuff, and I was having conversations. It became clear to me that I need to dig into this further, past the headlines and even past the articles, to find out what's going on. And the last couple of days, that's exactly what I've been doing. I've been grouping up with a few people who've been sharing links and digging into this. And yesterday, I noticed that Viva Fry, he was basically in a little bit of an argument online. And I'll go ahead and bring that up here because I think it's helpful for you to understand how I got to where I got to today. So here's this Twitter battle, if you want to call it that, an X battle with this Dr. Angela. I'm not even going to try to say her last name. I'm not very good at last names, as you guys all know. But as I went through this little thread Dr. Angela was providing, I had some questions. Above and beyond, just her flipping off David here. There was a lot of questions and things that she raised, and things that I don't understand, and I definitely wanted to learn more of. And as I was going through this, one of the things I thought I would do is reach out to her and have a conversation with her. That led me to trying to reach out to her because she doesn't have an open messaging. I talked to one of my biologist friends, thinking maybe through Dr. Kevin McKernan or something like that, we can connect to her because I want to ask questions. I thought she was a little bit abrupt. I made some assumptions. Some of the pushback that she was receiving on X, I had my own questions. So I was trying to reach out to her because I want to get to the source. And that's when I was talked to my friend, Dr. David Speaker, said, "Hey, look, do you know what's going on here? Who is she? What's this all about?" And he kind of gave me a little bit of a breakdown, but he was being very, very kind, and he was not giving me too much. But that's when he provided me with an opinion about her interview on the CBC by another doctor, Dr. Stevens Pelch, and I hope I'm saying that correct. Now, he's come across my desk a couple times. He was in the movie with Why Can't We Talk About This with Dean Rainey, Dr. Shoemaker, and Dr. Speaker. He was in that movie, and I was really impressed with him. So I've already made contact with him to talk to him about talking about Dan Hartman and other things, or Sean Hartman. So when his name came up again today, I'm like, oh boy, okay, so let me reach out to this guy. So I just called him, and we spent a half an hour on the phone today. And I asked him a whole bunch of questions, from what's going on with the company in Quebec all the way to the farm, the testing. I want to demystify a lot of this in my own head to understand what's going on. And that's where he really started to let me know his involvement. He was one of the experts that wasn't able to cross-examined during the federal court hearing, and his report was basically ignored by the court. And if you look in the decision, it lays out why they ignored his expertise. Basically, they were creating this nice little tiny box where like almost nobody fits into it, and then said, well, because of that, we're not going to listen to him. Given my coverage of Detective Helen Gruss, I absolutely see firsthand how the hearing can cause experts not to be included, that should be included, and how that can affect the outcome. So for the past few days, I've been going through that decision, but I only had basically that side of it, which was the court's version of what they believed was necessary in order to make their decision, is what they provided there. They didn't provide any of the other stuff, which I was really interested in. So full stop. I wanted to get to the bottom of this. The last couple of days on my show, I've been kind of hinting that there's a lot more to this, and there certainly is. And we'll get into that with Dr. Stephen here, because we wanted to bring you as as much of the information as possible, as much of the truth as possible, and strip away all of the sensationalized headlines and stuff like that. So because of the Viva Fry Twitter thing or X thing yesterday, I tried to dig in some more, got in contact with some experts, and then eventually spoke to one of the experts that actually knows really what's going on here. In addition to that, my little group that was doing a bunch of research, there's a whole bunch of other people doing stuff, and they're posting a bunch of things, and it's tough to know, who knows what they're talking about. Okay, and there's a particular knucklehead who's not in my group, but who has absolutely come out against me in the past, and I know it's fabricated completely lies. He's just a knucklehead. I just keep doing that. I found that he was pushing a narrative against the farm, providing a lot of the same information I was looking at and weaving it into a certain way that was kind of nefarious. And when I saw him doing that, and I know his history with me, I'm like, okay, well, this is a bad sort. He's a knucklehead. So let me kind of dig in further to what he was weaving. And that's when I kind of started to put a lot of these questions together and then took him to Dr. Steve Felch. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring him on. Good afternoon. How are you doing today?
Hi, Jason. So thank you for having me on.
My pleasure, and thanks for taking my call. Like, very rarely does somebody pick up on the second or third ring and then give me a half an hour. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate that. And you've also been very accommodating under these circumstances because we're kind of expediting things here. Supreme Court's involved. We're talking about the lives of some ostriches here. And thank you for making time on a Friday afternoon for us today.
Yeah, no, it's important to try to dispel some of the mythology that's developed around these birds with a narrative that's been, I guess, espoused by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, and then parroted by mainstream media with very little critical analysis provided. So I have served as an expert witness in these court cases in the federal court and in the appeal. But as you pointed out, a lot of the expert reports I spent so much time and energy putting together were essentially ignored by the judges. They took, I guess, what we would call a judicial notice stance, where if the government agency says this is true, then it must be true, just like water is wet and the air is the sky is blue. And unfortunately, my impression was that judges are supposed to look at the evidence provided by both parties and then weigh that evidence. But in fact, these judges really didn't do that, even though they claim they went through the exercise. I could tell from the decisions that were written by the judges that they completely bought hook, line, and sinker what the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's narrative was, even though I actually had refuted that extensively in my own reports with citations from literature.
Now, you're being very kind because you're calling it judicial notice, but this is a perversion of judicial notice. It's not supposed to be used that way. And I kind of call it judicial ignorance because I think it's above their heads and they just kind of defer it to the side that has, a lot of familiarity to them and maybe the same paycheck provider. And I've seen this a lot, like the detective Helen Bruce matter. They completely ignored all evidence from experts and just disregarded them without even justification. And we've seen this with a lot of trials, especially around COVID, and whether or not it was necessary, like the Ingram decision.
About 19 out of 20 cases, we were seeing judicial notice taken in the COVID-19 cases.
Yeah, and I'll give you one example here in Alberta. So the question was whether or not the Charter Section 1 applied, which is demonstrably justified reasoning, whether or not the government could go ahead and vindicate or ignore the rights of Canadians. And an expert witness that was brought forward in that case was Honorable Brian Peckford. His signature's on the thing. And the court says, no, you don't know what you're talking about. We know better. So, you see things like that. Like, it doesn't get more authoritative than one of the signers of the document to speak to the intention of that section, but got kicked out of court. So when I started to really pay more attention and go through this decision, it was clear to me that the decision was heavily government-sided. And then when I started talking to my virologist friends, Dr. Speaker, he put me on to you and your opinion. Let's kind of start first with this Dr. Angela or whatever, who went on to
Rasmussen.
BBC. Yeah, because my first question to you is like, who is she? And can you kind of comment on what she was talking about?
Well, she was making a number of claims in a CBC interview about a month ago, and she was saying, for example, that there was mountains and mountains of evidence that the stamping out policy was the most effective way to control the spread of the H5N1 influenza virus.
Now, when you
But
say stamping out, you mean calling, like killing the birds, stamping them out.
killing the birds, culling, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, slaughtering them. All the birds, any birds that are in contact with birds that have been infected are also executed. So the thing is that would be normally a strategy if this was being spread from farm to farm, but the reality is it's being spread from wild birds, hundreds of thousands of birds that are in the wild that have been migrating back and forth from Canada down even to Mexico, carrying the virus. We know that it was essentially endemic in the wild bird population, and it has since spread to a number of other animals, including mammals, both sea mammals as well as land mammals. And so the idea that this small farm with 2 ponds, which have since been drained, is going to be the ground zero for the next major spread of the virus is actually kind of ridiculous. And there's a number of factors, we'll discuss, I guess, in this interview, but there is no evidence that the stamping out policy itself, when you have a virus that's in the wild environment, is going to be contained by stamping it out on commercial poultry or dairy farms. We do this because we are concerned that maybe it could spread from one farm to another farm through workers that might be between those 2 or more locations.
The human workers between farms.
Yeah, it's a human transmission, but this virus doesn't transmit very well to humans at all. I mean, we've had in the last few years with the H5N1 avian influenza virus, we've had maybe about 71, 72 cases in United States and Canada combined. And most of those cases were actually not showing any signs, but they were tested by PCR, very sensitive technique to determine whether or not there's been exposure to a virus. And most of those cases were actually from dairy farms than from poultry farms. And in Canada, we only have 1 case of H5N1. It was in a 13-year-old girl who had comorbidities. So like, she's slightly overweight, and she definitely has some sort of immune deficiency, because she originally had went to the hospital. They had tested for H5N1 and she was negative. And then they sent her home. And then later she came back to the hospital. At that time, she was tested for H5N1. And she did recover, although she was, quite ill. But again, this is a very complicated case. We don't know how she got it. We do know that she had a dog that was sick, that was put down. So it's possible that she got it from her dog, but she never visited any chicken farms. So the other thing to bear in mind is that there's no case in the last, at least 60 years since the H5N1 virus was originally identified, of a transmission from a human to a human. So if it's not likely transmitted from a human to a human, then I think even the case of the farm workers going from a farm contaminated with the chickens going to another farm, that would be from a human to now back to an animal. It's probably not very, very likely either.
Now, one of the things that you said on the call earlier that kind of surprised me was a lot of those cases in the U.S., You mentioned they were with cows, but you also mentioned that they were during the culling process itself.
That's right.
So the infected birds themselves exposed to humans, and some of these numbers came from there.
That's correct. And so when you think about it, these are cases where they actively went out and tested these people. And we don't know what the numbers are of the actual total number of people that were handling these animals that did have H5N1 virus exposure, but never got sick and were never tested. But bearing that in mind, we have about I've heard that maybe there's 2 cases of deaths from H5N1. Again, one case I'm aware of is an elderly man, 65, who had chickens in his backyard, not on a commercial operation, and had comorbidities. So if you think about that, we're talking about, assuming that we tested everyone who possibly was infected, and again, I think that number is much, much larger. We're looking at about a 1 in 70 chance, again, with comorbidities, much like we saw with SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, the thing is, in the courts, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has been arguing that historically, if we look at the data that goes back over that 60 years, that half the people who were infected with the virus actually died. So they're talking about a 50% case fatality rate, which is absolutely ridiculous. Certainly, where we have data where the number of people that have died in the last 15 years or so has been documented by the World Health Organization, we're looking at, I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but it's in the order of around 800 cases, of which about 450 have died. And so, yes, you're seeing what seems to be this 50% case fatality rate, but this is all cases, 89% of them were actually cases from Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, with these poultry farms, which if you've seen how these are maintained in these countries, it's actually they're not really very sterile, like well-maintained, clean facilities. They'll take these chickens upside down and they'll let them sit dead, and then their excrement is going into the water and it's spread everywhere. So in this case, we've got, like I say, about 89% of those cases where there's documented fatalities is actually in Southeast Asia. And it was actually very rare to see in North America. But even in those countries, despite all this handling and the widespread extent of the wild birds carrying the virus, there's very, very few people that have ever actually even gotten sick, never mind died from it. So this narrative that's been presented by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to the courts, that this is a deadly virus that's going to cause 50% mortality, and that it's going to be the basis of potentially a new pandemic amongst humans, it's just very far-fetched. It's amazing that they're even presenting such a scenario.
Now, another piece of this narrative that caught my vision is there's a pond, and 400 or 500 wild ducks have come through there, according to the CFIA. What is the concern there, if any, of these wild ducks sharing the pond in an open air facility? Birds, even if they have H5N1.
Right. Well, I mean, the basically the Food Inspection Agency has described that these birds, that they're shedding the virus, and that it's getting into the soil and into the water, and that if new birds come to the site, that they could be infected by this kind of what we call fomites off of surfaces. And this is just not how influenza works. Influenza is a very small virus. That's an RNA virus, even slightly smaller than the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is also an RNA virus. It's very simple. It only has about 10 genes. SARS-CoV-2 has 28 genes encoding different proteins that are necessary for the virus. And it's transmitted in an aerosol form in droplets in the air, which of course will evaporate in size, and the exposure to sunlight with the UV radiation that's in the sunlight just completely mutates the virus so that it's completely inactive. So it sterilizes it. And in fact, RNA itself, and these are RNA viruses, like I said, it's very unstable. So this is the reason why even influenza in humans is very rarely acquired from touching surfaces. It's by being in an area where the virus is in the air and it's being breathed. So when you're in an open air environment, the chances of actually being infected is further reduced than you would be, for example, in a room that's contained and you have less spreading of the virus from the sick person or animal that is sending out the virus, usually from their mouth and nose. So this is not how the virus normally propagates. The experiments that were referred to in the courts by the CFA, and there's only really one study that really looked into this in any kind of detail. They took water that, and it can be like dirty water, it doesn't matter, but what they did is they filtered it. And they filtered it through a mesh that's a 200 micron mesh, which means that anything that's 200 microns or bigger can't go through the mesh. But the virus is 140 microns in that range, and it can go through the mesh. So they take this highly filtered water, they leave it in a metal containers, basically out of any light, and they store it in a refrigerator at close to freezing temperature for 1 year, no more than that. And then they take that and try to inoculate cells in culture, and they can see that the virus is still able to propagate in those infected cells. So technically, yes, it is possible to keep the virus stock preserved during that time, as long as you don't expose it to any light and no microbial action, which is completely unrepresentative of what happens, in a wild environment. So it's really very far-fetched to think that this site would be full of virus that's going to be infecting new birds coming in. We do know it's the birds that came in that originally brought the virus. And you've got tens of thousands of little ponds and lakes throughout British Columbia. And to think that these two ponds, which have been drained since then, are going to be the source of a new spread of this virus, is preposterous, because these birds are healthy. They are not sick. They have no symptoms. They haven't for 9 months. And we know that the ostriches can be sensitive to the virus, because originally with this outbreak that was in December of 2024 and January 2025, 69 birds died. Now, those 69 birds were all birds that were more recently had come to the farm and therefore may not have been exposed to this virus before. But all of the birds that have been on the site prior to 2022, they actually, none of them got sick. So we suspect, and when I say we, when I'm talking about my colleagues and I, we think that what's happened is that they have been exposed to the virus in the past. Most of them have, fully recovered. Many of them hardly even got sick in the first place. And they had antibody resistance. Their immune systems were already tuned up. And the newer birds that died, that were naive, they hadn't been exposed to the virus before. What happened to us, some of them did die. So that tells us that the ostrich, like the chickens or the ducks or the geese, are susceptible to a highly pathogenic influenza virus and will die. But in this case, 85% of the birds, even if you include the newer ones, 85% of the birds completely recovered. And most of them never even got sick. So that tells us that actually they probably had immune protection. And I kind of confirmed that for myself when I got access to eggs that were from that farm that were collected in the summer of 2024. And so this is before the recent outbreak. And in the yolks of these eggs is where they have an antibody, IgY antibodies. These are really concentrated in the yolk of those eggs. And we tested them using a test that we'd originally, with a methodology that we'd applied to SARS-CoV-2 and looking at antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 proteins. We did this for the H5 and the N1 proteins of the influenza virus, the avian influenza viruses. And we picked portions of those proteins that are not the same in the other H, hemagglutinin proteins, or the other N, or neuraminidase proteins, that would clearly be only from the H5N1. And we found that of the 18 different eggs we tested from different birds, they all had antibodies against the H5N1 protein. So everything starts to make sense. These birds were probably exposed in the past. Many of them developed antibody responses. Some of them, maybe for the first time, were exposed to it, and they developed antibody responses. And this accounts for why, after the die-off of some of the birds, the rest of the birds were completely recovered, and they've stayed that way for 9 months. So in order to be shedding virus, you need to have the virus actively reproducing in the bird. And to make it really infectious, you have to have a high viral load. And so when the birds have no symptoms, that means that the immune system has kept the number of these virus particles, if they are even there, in check. So they have a very low viral load, very low risk of actually transmitting. And it would have to be transmitted from these birds being in very, very close proximity with other birds. And maybe that happens at feeding stations, but it's not coming from drinking the water. It's not coming from the feces that are dropped by the ostriches. I mean, think about this. You've got tens of thousands of birds that are flying across BC for the last few years that have been contaminated, those flocks, with the H5N1 virus has been essentially rampant in those birds. They land on the parks, the schoolyards, the dikes where I live around Richmond, and their excrement is everywhere. And yet, we only have one case in the whole of Canada for H5N1 in a human. So that, I think, illustrates very clearly the risk of the soil on this farm as being transmissible of the H5N1 virus to other birds, to other members of the flock, which are probably all resistant now, plus to the farm workers. So I think that kind of puts it into perspective.
Another piece of this puzzle is, as you mentioned, when there was a new flock added or a bunch of birds added, most of those are the ones that pass, because typically there's about a 15% survival rate or an 85% death rate. But the other birds that were there for a long time, all of them basically lived.
They all survived. Yeah, they didn't die. None of those birds.
Yeah, which means when it comes to examining, well, why did they live? They're supposed to be all dead now because of this outbreak. And that's what led to our conversation to be going, well, wait a minute, maybe there is something special about these birds because they should all be dead, or like a high number of them should be dead now.
And I think the argument that the CFIA has tried to advance is that, well, ostriches are different from the other birds and that they may not get sick. And interestingly, Angela Rasmussen basically had argued that, well, these birds can not fight basically the virus, don't develop antibodies, and therefore they're propagating this virus in their bodies without getting sick. I mean, people have to understand that when you are ill with a viral infection or a bacterial infection, the runny nose, the coughing, basically the mucus that's being produced, the soreness in the body is really the immune system being activated, and you get swelling. And if it was a bacterial or viral infection that was intestinal, then you would get diarrhea. These are all signs of what the body does to fight the viral infection, including the elevated temperature. When you have an elevated temperature, your immune system actually works better. And these are cleaning actions to try to reduce the viral load in the body. Unfortunately, when people are very sick, then they're more able to transmit the virus as well, especially an aerosol type virus. So this is why if you have no symptoms, it tells you the viral load must be very low, and the viral load's low means that the immune system must be working. And so if someone gets influenza and they recover, 2 weeks later, we're not saying that these people are infectious anymore, right? And so this is where you have a period where there could be an infection from an animal or a person who's not sick at that moment, is just prior to them getting sick, but not after they've recovered from getting sick. So this is the same scenario with these birds.
Okay, and a couple more things that Dr. Angela said was we have agreements in place, global agreements in place for trade. And you mentioned stamping out as one of the options, but your opinion piece also talked about burning out, I think it was.
Yeah.
What are the differences in those two, and what is the actual truth with these agreements? Do we have to call the birds, or is there another option?
Every country can follow its own internal decisions on how it wants to accept the recommendations of the World Organization for Animal Health. And so this is kind of like the WHO counterpart when it comes to animals. Now, the thing is that originally the World Organization for Animal Health, and this is represented from organizations like the Canadian Food Inspection Agency from different countries. So they have their own experts, they get together, they'll have some sort of studies that are done, and then they'll come up with their recommendations. And so their recommendation for highly pathogenic influenza virus, not low pathogenicity avian influenza virus, but high pathogenicity, where you have at least 85% of the animals are expected to actually expire when there's an outbreak. They recommended up to last year, if you call the animals, all the animals that are exposed to the infected birds, then after 3 months, then that zone, so a zone can be a very small area, that zone will in fact be considered disease-free. And with that disease-free status, then that allows more trade with products from other animals, other birds in this case, from within from that zone. That was changed in the last year to 1 month. Okay, so the virus hasn't really changed, but the policy has changed. And so if you have an outbreak and you do the culling and there's no other evidence of an outbreak since then that zone gets disease-free status. We have several zones in British Columbia, and the Universal Ostrich Farm is in its own zone. So what goes on in that farm does not affect the disease status from the other zones, especially where most of the poultry farms are located in southwestern British Columbia. So the other alternative, which is perfectly acceptable to the World Organization for Animal Health, and which is practiced by other countries, is that if you allow the disease to take its course, and you have these surviving animals, if there's no other evidence in the zone of another outbreak within a year or after a year, then that zone also gets disease-free status. So in fact, if the ostrich farm went another 2.5 months or 3 months, it would be disease-free again, according to the World Health Organization standards, and you'd be able to do trading. Now, there are some agreements where it's not by zone for the animal products being allowed to be sold internationally. Sometimes it's by province. So there are some countries where this is the case, that this could affect the trade. And the largest trading partners I gather we have where this is true is Russia and Mexico. And in fact, I find it very hard to believe that Mexico is going to be looking for chicken products from Canada and BC, but nonetheless. So in those cases, you can make an argument. However, if you look over the last few years, we've had 533 outbreaks of influenza on farms in Canada, many of them in British Columbia itself. So you would not expect that there has even been the disease-free status maintained for the last few years in Canada, or certainly in British Columbia. So, but despite that, during this period of time, our trade has actually increased with products from poultry farms internationally. So it doesn't appear that when you look at the actual record of the trade, it has been adversely affected by the H5N1 virus and the pandemic that we've had here in Canada. It's everywhere in the world, and a lot of the spread has been in places like Mexico and some of these other countries. So, yeah, I think it's a bit of a red herring, personally.
Okay, so thanks for clarifying that as well. And what we're going to be doing shortly is we're going to move from the H5N1 conversation to the COVID research conversation, because the two parts at this particular farm that I think are really important here. But concluding the H5N1 portion of this conversation, is there a reason in your mind for the culling to actually happen, or is there another option here to keep the birds alive?
Well, the good news is that the chances that these birds actually still have H5N1 virus is from everything I know of my experience, and I've been involved in immunology research for a good 40 years. I've been on faculty at UBC for 38, but I've been running biotech companies for 30 years, producing antibodies, by the way, in rabbits against cancer proteins and proteins involved in neurological diseases. So I know a lot about the production of antibodies and how stable they are. And the reality is that these, from the standpoint of a risk that these are infectious for H5N1, to me, that risk it's astronomically low. There's been absolutely no evidence provided by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency with these birds, because they refused to test them after they did only basically taking samples from 2 birds that had died, and these carcasses are more than 24 hours old, on the ground, basically. They took and took samples from the mouth and the anus of the 2 dead birds, and they didn't even do a control when they did the PCR testing to see that the samples were actually confirmed to be from an ostrich. I mean, you may say, well, but this is where they got the samples from. But don't forget that this is being sent to a facility where they're routinely testing all these other samples right next to each other. And the thing about the PCR test, it is so sensitive that cross-contamination is actually extremely common and a very high potential. So usually we have a control where you actually demonstrate that you have ostrich RNA that's there in addition to the particular RNA that you're trying to test for from the virus, okay? So they didn't, as far as I'm aware, do that. So they don't have a control. They're doing at very high cycle threshold numbers. And so what that means is the more cycle threshold numbers you have to do in the PCR test, the more you amplify the amount of original starting material. And so when you're doing something in the order of 36 cycles, that's 2 to the 36 power each. You're doubling the amount of material in each cycle. But it's an enzymatic reaction done by an enzyme that can induce errors into the structure of the RNA. Ultimately, it starts with RNA, but it's converted to a DNA copy, and then that's what's amplified. So you actually get each cycle introduces mutations in the sequence of what you're trying to amplify. And so you get essentially not only amplifying what would be active virus, but you're amplifying more often when you're getting to those high threshold numbers, the remnants and pieces of the RNA that's left over. And so you get like a 90% false positive rate. Now, to the credit of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, they did subsequently, and this is after they gave the order for the cull, sequenced the entire genome. And that's when they found out that it was in fact an H5N1 virus. Prior to that, they did not know. They did not test for the N1 gene from the virus. All they tested was whether it was H5 or H7. They did not test that it was highly pathogenic or low pathogenicity. And yet they made the claim in the courts, and this was repeated in the judge's decisions, that this was an H5N1 highly pathogenic virus was identified at the time that they did the cull order. And so everything they've done since then has been to try to prove, their case. And yes, it did turn out to be H5N1, but it was a mix of the genes from a high pathogenicity version with a low pathogenicity version. There's these 10 genes. They're distributed on 8 separate pieces of the RNA that are found in these influenza viruses. And so they had a reassortment, which was a mix of low pathogenicity virus with high pathogenicity virus. That doesn't mean that it's highly pathogenic anymore. It actually starts to take on the traits of both, depending upon what genes are actually put together. You don't end up with a more highly pathogenic version when you're mixing it with a lower pathogenicity version. You might end up with something that's similar, but it's not going to be more pathogenic. Now, the thing is that this kind of testing, it was never really tested in birds, and we only found out recently from when the appeal went to the Federal Court of Appeal. There was material provided, new material provided by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that made the claim that they had done mouse studies with the virus and that it was the most deadly version that they had ever tested. Now, I went and I read that document that was provided, and actually it's very vague because first of all, the expert that had submitted this in her basically affidavit said that this was told to her by people at the Winnipeg microbiology laboratory, so it's secondhand information. There was no documentation from the person that she claimed had actually made this as part of, for example, an exhibit, in the affidavit. And when you read the statement that she's quoting from I don't know where, this individual is basically saying that it's the type of the virus that's the most deadly, and that they're put it into mice, and this, has been the most effective in killing these mice, even better than the influenza virus they recovered from cattle. Now, the thing is this: if all you've done is taken 2 samples of the virus from 2 dead birds, and you do a PCR test, even if you sequence the genome, you still have to produce the virus, because you need to be able to replicate that virus in living cells. And so you have to isolate the actual virus, not a portion of it. That means that they must be making the actual virus in that lab. And there's no evidence that they've actually recovered or made this virus. So I think that when that statement was submitted as part of that affidavit, it's very misleading in what they actually know. And there's no reason to believe that this would be a more deadly virus. First of all, a mouse is a mammal, and it's actually very hard normally for an avian virus to infect a mammal. Now, it's possible that these are genetically engineered mice, where they're actually producing the proteins to which the virus binds. It's sialic acids that are unique in birds that are different from the sialic acids that are on proteins in mammals, including humans. So they may have made a bird equivalent in the mouse to allow this infectivity. But this is not this is some sort of a genetically engineered mouse that is not necessarily representative at all of the ability of normally this virus to infect a mammal, never mind a bird. Plus, I don't even think they had the virus. There's no, it's a lot of work to actually produce such a virus in quantities that you can do these kind of studies. So I'm rather dubious. There's no data that's actually been published or presented to support this argument, and yet this is the sort of material that's been going out from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and has been, parroted by mainstream media like CBC, and really the evidence is not there. And in a court of law, you have to have evidence that is either this work was done by that individual and they can speak to it, or they have to cite the scientific literature or other sources where it's been published that that this is actually the case, if the expert themselves hasn't actually done that work.
Also, in a court of law, there's a process to cross-examine, which you didn't go through. They didn't bother cross-examining you on your report.
Yeah, they had the opportunity, by the way. They could cross-examine me, but they didn't want to do that, because then it would be much clearer in the court record that some of the statements and assertions that they made are actually incorrect, or they're presented in such a way to be rather misleading. Like I was saying, for example, of this 50% case fatality rate, that when you look at what's happened with the particular type of virus strain, this family member, this a 2.3.4.4b, which is the one that was in the birds here in North America, that was spreading to farms as well. That has, at least certainly in humans, doesn't have a lethality rate like that. It's not 50%. It's probably way less than even a fraction of a percent, because you have to look at all the cases of exposure, and we don't have that data.
Well, they could easily, change the numbers all they want, and they can say, of all known cases in Canada that we can confirm, it was 100% mortality because it was 1 of 1.
That's right. Really, well, the other thing too that's been rather deceiving, I thought, was they've been making this case that this reassortment of 3 of the chromosomes, or there's segments of the genome from the low pathogenicity, and 3 from the high pathogenic, so you have 8 together, that was what you need to make a virus particle that could actually reproduce itself. They said that this is a unique reassortment. And you have to understand that to get a reassortment, you have to have the same animal, the same host, infected with 2 different strains infecting not only that same host, but the same cells in that host. And this is an extremely rare event. I mean, you have to figure the human body has about 50 trillion cells. And the ostrich is, 9 feet tall, could be up to 350 pounds. And so it's got even way more cells than we do as humans. And the chances that two viruses are going to infect the same cell at the same time, because actually there is a process in cells that once the cell is infected, it's already mounting a bit of a response against further infection, then this is extremely rare. Now, the only way this really happens is that we have a very large population of infected animals, and then it's being infected by multiple strains of the virus. Then you might see this kind of emerge over time, and it slowly happens, and then the low pathogenicity versions are the ones that predominate because they don't kill the host. And then what happens is it's easier for it to spread to other birds, and then they develop an immune response, so then they're resistant to future infections, and then that's how you kind of get this shift. Just like we saw with SARS-CoV-2, the earlier versions of SARS-CoV-2 were probably a bit more deadly, but eventually we had a series of new variants that emerged, and then we got to the Omicron ones, and they're like the common cold. They generally don't kill people, but they're very infectious, and that's what we saw. And I think the same thing has happened in the wild bird population, and I think that these ostriches actually acquired that reassorted virus actually from the wild birds, even though they claim they've not detected this in wild birds. I find it very unlikely that it would have developed from just a few ostriches that happened to be infected with two different influenza strains at the same time in such a limited population of birds. That's just a very unlikely scenario. But here's the rub. What they did not tell people, but we did find this through our cross-examination. When I say us, I'm talking about the lawyers for the Canadian, for the Universal Ostrich Farms. Their lawyers cross-examined the experts from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and they admitted they have 100 cases of reassortment in the 533 outbreaks. We don't know how many of them they did full genome sequencing for. It could have been even half of them. But even to have 100 out of 533 cases, you're getting close to like 18, 19% of those cases being reassortments. That's just not possible. It has to be from the wild. So this is why, this is not unique reassortment. These birds, there's no reason to believe that if they're asymptomatic, they have no signs of illness, that they're still infected. Even if they were shedding, which is highly unlikely, that it would survive in the ground is again not borne by experience in the past from influenza infections. Like a lot of this, when you start to put this house of cards together and realize how flimsy it is, that this case that they're building, it's just remarkable that the judges have gone with this so far, despite the fact that they've been presented with the reasons why these arguments are highly flawed.
And that's the challenge with judges, because if they're listening to one side and disregarding another, then they're not going to get a good, well-rounded education on this. I do want to talk about the research value of these particular birds, because they didn't seem to die during the outbreak. Maybe the new ones did, but not the older ones. Now, you mentioned that BC has a program, or they're putting together a project worth about $2 million to research this kind of thing. Is this these birds, would these be valuable to that kind of research going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, one of the reasons for preserving these ostriches is that we have very little information on how these birds, when they're having a burnout, how they will respond. So this information and what kind of immune response they have, that is valuable information. Now, the BC government has announced, I think, about $2.5 million in funding to try to protect the poultry farms in British Columbia from future infection. And the way they're trying to do this is to use filters and also ultraviolet, radiation. Ultraviolet, as I've expressed to you before, from sunlight is sufficient to actually destroy the virus. But the filters, if they have the filter size is strong enough, it's able to capture the virus. However, this is not such an easy thing to do with filters, because even the N95 masks that people wear to try to protect against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the mesh size, the pore size, was much larger than the virus. So the coronavirus was about 0.6 microns, 600 microns, 0.6 microns in size. You have, as it turns out, almost slightly smaller, the influenza virus. So most of the filters won't really trap or prevent the virus from going through. However, if you were to coat those filters with antibodies against the H5N1 virus, you would be able to capture them in the filters and they wouldn't come through. Plus, you can then take the filters and you can stain them so that if the virus is present, the filters will have color. This has all been done for SARS-CoV-2 with the collaborators that the Universal Ostrich Farm had with the University precinct for Kyoto. And they were working with an ostrich researcher there, and that researcher was developing these kind of masks and filters, just like I talked about, but for SARS-CoV-2, not for the H5N1. But when you're trying to produce these kind of antibodies that you would use in such an application, you want to use antibodies where you can get large amounts. Now, as I said earlier, the yolk of these eggs, they have the equivalent in terms of antibodies in what it would take me to, like, let's say I was to inject the same proteins into rabbits, I would need 10 rabbits worth of antibodies to get what I can get from one egg from an ostrich. And one ostrich can lay about 30 or more eggs per season. So we're not even touching, apart from an injection under, into the skin of these ostriches, the antigen, in this case, it could be proteins from the virus. But the thing is, all of these birds have already been exposed to the actual virus, and they've recovered, and they produce antibodies already in their eggs. And so I think these eggs have laid another 300, these ostriches laid another 300 eggs in this last, this year. And so those eggs, which are sterile, by the way, all eggs are sterile unless they're cracked or something, are full of antibodies that would recognize the H5N1 virus that could be used in developing these kind of filters to protect the other farms from actually getting infected with these H5N1 virus. I mean, this is the irony of it. These birds actually could save birds on other farms and other farms from being infected. But instead, we're blaming them as potential sources of the virus. And that's just not the case.
Okay, and I know that you have a really busy evening, so I'm going to try and squeeze out a few more minutes from you, if you don't mind, because there's this connection to a lab in Quebec, Immune Biosolutions. They received $13.44 million to develop biomanufacture its promising immunotherapy to treat COVID-19 and its variants. Now, this particular farm has a loose connection. We don't know if there's a financial one or not, but they were doing some work here. Can you take us through what this was? Because this was in 2021, this announcement, and what was going on with this work, if you can.
Well, I've talked to the owners of the farm about it because I was not involved in this. I was not involved with the farm at all prior to the outbreak, and I have no financial interests or any business arrangements or anything like that. Even the expert reports I prepared have all been for free, because I think it's very important to educate the courts on what's actually going on here. So, but from what I understand from David Belinsky, who's one of the owners of that farm, is they had an arrangement with this company. The company did pay them initially to take their ostriches, the female ones, and inject them, as it turns out, with the protein, the spike protein, into the birds so they could recover the antibodies from the egg yolks of these ostriches when they laid their eggs. And they had experiments already that were very promising that showed that they were producing antibodies. But then the company apparently got taken over by another company, and that other company, I gathered, then terminated the project with the Universal Ostrich Farm. So they have all these birds with all these eggs, which actually have SARS-CoV-2 spike protein antibodies in them. And I know that for a fact because I actually had tested them as well, because I ran a 4,500 person clinical study looking at which parts of the SARS-CoV-2 virus proteins elicited the strongest antibody responses. So we actually took those tests and we tried them on the ostrich egg yolks, and confirmed they actually have still spike protein antibodies. And some people have argued, oh, well, this is experimental work going on. Why is this controlled? People have to remember that it's the spike protein itself that was injected into people when they were getting the vaccine that was the two Chinese vaccines or the Russian Sputnik vaccine. That's how most people in the world were actually vaccinated. Most people didn't get the RNA vaccines or the DNA vaccines. They actually got vaccines that were the actual spike protein, just like the ostriches, injected into them. So after that, then the farm, from what I understand, then decided they would try to work with other partners to see if they could develop the spike protein antibodies that would be in their ostrich eggs. But I don't think that went very far, because then the call order came, and they're not allowed to do anything with these ostriches or their eggs. So this is basically what's happened.
And the reason why I keep kind of going back to the research value of these, whether it's H5N1 or SARS-CoV-2 or the spike protein antibodies, is because one of the exceptions to a call order is if there's research value here. And this CFIA said there is none here. I've heard two good reasons so
They
far.
say so, but the National Institutes of Health argues otherwise. So I would give a lot of credence to the ability of the U.S. National Institutes of Health to recognize that these have scientific value. I can certainly see the scientific value of this, and many of my colleagues can that are scientists, but this has not been recognized by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And even some of their experts have admitted that there's a lot of things that they don't know about, this infection and what happens in ostriches in particular. And so there's a lot of unknowns. And when you have unknowns, this is where you do scientific research. And this is a fabulous opportunity, because since we've culled all these other outbreaks, so there is no survivors, we don't have any real information on the survivability of these birds to the present forms of the virus that are circulating in the wild birds.
Now, if you go through the decision, the CFIA says they're not equipped for it. They don't have the establishment to set up. They don't carry logs. They have all these reasons why they say they're not qualified. But wouldn't it make sense to go ahead and, if that is the case, move them to another facility alive to go ahead and extend their scientific value?
Well, you have to understand, you don't need to do scientific research with a lab to begin with. You just have to collaborate with other labs that have those capabilities. I mean, my lab has those kind of capabilities, but there's many other labs, and including in other companies, that would be very interested in isolating these antibodies. These antibodies are very unique compared to from mammals that we would normally source antibodies from, in that they're very stable to almost boiling temperatures and acidic and very basic extreme alkali conditions, which makes them extremely robust for applications like in filters and masks. They don't need to be specially refrigerated or prepared. And at the same time, the ostriches represent a source of a large amount of biological material. So that means that you can get consistent batches that you can make worthwhile to test. So there's a number of special advantages. But for example, where we have our antibodies produced in rabbits in United States in San Diego, we've been doing it for about 15 years with that company. They're not a research facility, but they assist other companies and academic labs in universities to do their research by taking the proteins and other antigens, injecting these rabbits, and then feeding them, re-injecting them, and eventually taking blood from these, which they send back to the labs. And that's what happens. These blood samples are sent back to us from the States. We provide the antigens, they provide back to us the blood, then we purify, and then we test, and we do the research. So the argument that you have to be a research facility with lab and everything, that's not the way it works in the real world, in the research field, when you want to have antibodies produced.
Well, when you're at court and you don't get to hear from the other side, or you choose not to hear the other side, it may be very confusing to you that is an option. But what we've heard now is they survived when they shouldn't have. They likely don't have it anymore because so many months went by. They likely are not spreading it. They may have received it through the wild birds. And nothing much has to change in their facility for them to stay alive. And they have scientific research. Did I kind of cover
That's
the bases?
right. Yeah, they're being used for scientific research. They sent me those ostrich eggs from, before the outbreak in the summer, like I say, of 2024. They sent me those from a different site, not the site that's under quarantine, but another place where they had these prior eggs stored. And so I'm doing research with those ostrich eggs. I'm finding out what are the parts of the H5N1 virus proteins to which these birds are more likely to produce antibodies. That kind of information is very useful, where in the future I can make portions of those proteins, not the whole protein, but chemically make small fragments, which could then be injected into birds, and then they would make antibodies against those fragments, just like I've been doing for the last 30 years in rabbits, and produce antibodies that in fact could even be protective for these animals, but also those antibodies can be used for diagnostic purposes. And they can be used for therapeutic purposes. So, for example, if you took those ostrich eggs and you enzymatically cut them into in half, there's one half of those that would actually could be injected into people that are infected with the virus and give them an antibody, protection when they don't have it yet, but the virus is rampant. This is sort of what we saw with monoclonal antibody therapy during early COVID. We could do the same thing with these ostrich antibodies for someone who was severely sick with H5N1. So, I mean, this is the potential is endless for what can be done with these ostriches.
And as we wrap up here, because again, I know that you have a busy evening, what are your credentials? Can you go ahead and go through them for the people that are curious? What are your credentials?
I have a PhD in biochemistry from the University of British Columbia. I postdoced abroad in Scotland and then in the United States with a Nobel Prize winner looking at cell communication systems. I was recruited to the University of British Columbia to work in the Biomedical Research Center, which is an immunology institute. And I was there for about 5-6 years. But I've been on faculty at UBC doing continuous research as a faculty member for 38 years. I started 2 biotech companies, Connexus Bioinformatics, most recently for the last 26 years. Prior to that, I was the founder of Contact Pharmaceuticals, Inc. And I've also been working with the Canadian Citizens Care Alliance. I'm the co-chair of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee. And these are scientists from across the country, and we discuss things like the immunology and antibodies and viruses within our group of experts. So this is really what informs me to make the statements that I have made, and why I think it's very important to make sure that we have, it's clear to the general public what is actually going on here, and where is the risk, and where are the benefits. And I hope I've been able to explain some of that this evening.
Yeah, you certainly demystified a lot of things in my mind, especially around the research, the COVID stuff they were doing, and then also the antibodies that were being produced, tested, and confirmed before the outbreak and the call order came in place. Is there any last little comments or statements you'd like to leave the public with that they may need to know?
No, just that at this point, I think a lot of people in the general public have been wondering about this. They're getting a message from mainstream media of how dangerous these birds are and what's absolutely necessary to eradicate them. It has a lot of impact on food security. I think the story with these ostriches, for me, I've been really very disappointed by how this has all been handled by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. It undermines my confidence in the agency. I think in the minds of a lot of people that are in the general public, they're wondering what's going on. But it seems to be kind of like a precedent in a way for future erosions of property rights, of ownership of in this case it'd be animals. It's a little bit of government overreach. I think the intent of the legislation and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is to protect Canadians, but we want to make sure that those resources are deployed in a way that it's actually going to be effective and it's going to make a difference. And this is kind of, to me, an example of government waste, of redeployment and resources in directions that are actually not very fruitful. And I think it's going to undermine public confidence in the agency. And this is not the only government agency right now that has probably poor morale within the government agency. We've heard about this with the Canadian Revenue Agency, and the low morale there and the poor service that's coming from there. And it's believed that this has actually been permeating throughout our government agencies. And I suspect that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency may be another one of those. So it's very disappointing. I hope that common sense will prevail and that we can do a major improvement in the practices that are going on and reevaluate the stamping out policy, because I think there are other effective means that can be applied without wiping out these small farms. The larger farms have been impacted too, but this is really, again, a further erosion of food security actually in Canada. And these ostriches are pretty unique. If we call this herd, I suspect we're probably killing at least 20% of all the ostriches in the entire country. And again, that has to be questionable, because the number of ostrich farms has dramatically declined in the last 2 decades. And these birds have remarkable opportunities besides food that can be extremely important to even biomedical research and the development of new diagnostics and therapeutics. So I hope that the Supreme Court will at least listen to the arguments and give an opportunity for us to make our case. So thanks again, Jason.
Yeah, no problem. We can pray for that. I'm not confident. Supreme Court usually kind of doesn't even take this up. We're going to have to see where that goes. But if there's enough public pressure, we have the Conservative Party now talking about it, maybe there's going to be enough pressure to go ahead and have a hearing and hear it out, and have somebody like you show up and explain what you just explained with us as well. So thank you very much for your time on this. I think it was incredibly valuable. And I know you offered me more time next week and stuff, but I think we had to get this out as soon as possible. Time is of the essence.
Appreciate that. I got to go.
Yeah, bye. And can I share your contact with some people that does podcasts?
Yes, absolutely. It's fine. You can reach me at Pelech, like my name, Steve Pelech, at shaw, shaw.ca. So spelech at shaw.ca. Okay?
Excellent. Yeah, and I'll send it
Okay.
out to some people I know. Have a great day. Enjoy your evening. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
But a generous man with his time, and it was pretty important to get that out. And we got every minute we could out of him because even 24 hours ago, I knew none of this. So this is why we're digging hard, spending a lot of time on this kind of thing, and to talk to the sources. I was reading the decision, and there was a lot of big holes in there because what was the farm's position? Like, why did they have the desire to go ahead and go to the federal court and fight so hard? What was going on? Because it was so empty. You saw their name, but then they said they were basically disqualified because they weren't experts, that it included being part of an outbreak as well. Like, again, it created this small little box for the experts to fit in that wasn't fair. And I've seen other cases where they do that, especially COVID, the Ingram decision with the Honorable Peckford, Detective Helen Gruce with all her witnesses, and there's been many, many more examples where the courts excluded experts who absolutely could counter and make sure that the judge understands more of the information. And again, there's cross-examination. So if the petitioners, which would be the government, if they didn't like what was going on or being said, they can cross-examine and challenge in front of the judge. That didn't happen. That didn't happen here at all. So there's a lot of missing information going on. So I thank him for taking the time to provide us with that information, taking time to speak with me earlier today, and also to everybody involved in making that phone call happen. So if you're a podcaster, if you didn't get the email address there, you can reach out. I'll go ahead and get it to you and make sure that you can connect, because these are the conversations we need to have. So thank you all very much for hanging out with me tonight on this impromptu conversation. I hope it was valuable to some of you. It certainly was valuable to me. I learned a lot, and I'm going to keep digging because there's a lot more information to get, and maybe I'll be able to get Dr. Brian Bridle and the third expert that was not allowed to speak, and I'll bring that to you if I'm successful at that. Have yourself a wonderful evening. Please go take care of yourself and each other, and God bless.